So my name is Francisco Nunes. I'm a senior researcher at Fraunhofer Portugal ICOS, and this work I'm presenting today was done together with Geraldine Fitzpatrick. Geraldine is also at the conference, so feel free also to discuss this work with her. I would like to first start by making some clarifications about the title. So understanding the mundane nature of self-care, ethnographic accounts of people living with Parkinson's. When I'm referring to self-care, I'm talking about the things that people do because they live with a chronic condition. Self-care includes things like dealing with symptoms, managing the treatment, adapting to the conditions. It's necessarily connected with medical care, but different from it. When I talk about mundane, I'm referring to the practical, routine, or banal aspects of living with a chronic condition. Now, the motivation behind this work has been the boom in self-care technologies that has happened in the recent years. Medical devices, telehealth systems, telecare solutions, or home care technologies have become more and more common. In the context of cost reductions and austerity, technology was often seen as the key enabler that would enable a care reform and reduce costs. But despite the favorable political will and investment, the uptake did not accompany. And while we have many self-care technologies, they are not being used. Technology is not neutral in this debate. The design can support or hinder people's practices, and in this way it may leverage or prevent the uptake. Design is certainly not the only factor, but it's a necessary part of the uptake, so it's important to consider it. And it's very concerning to see that some studies are reporting that technologies are forcing people to change their self-care by challenging people's identity, or the way that they engage in self-care. Technologies are kind of forcing changes into self-care. There is also some research that is arguing that participants are rejecting pilots of self-care technologies because they feel that they will need to change the way in which they engage in self-care. And we contend that these misalignments between self-care technologies and the everyday life of the people are due to a medicalization of self-care technologies. We say that self-care technologies are medicalized because they capture practical aspects of living with a chronic condition under a medical perspective. Self-care technologies often afford usage with clinicians within structured medical processes. For example, if we think about a medication reminder, it often has many of the characteristics of medication practices from the hospital. For example, we might wake up on the weekend at a later time than on the weekday, but there is no way of putting the reminder to have different schedules for weekend and the weekdays. While we might delay, replan, snooze our medication, there's no way usually to do that in an app. Also, technologies for monitoring symptoms also have some characteristics that make them medicalized. The example is usually that they are trying to collect some clinical data, or that the patients cannot simply access the data that they just produced. These features give us an idea that these technologies might also be medicalized. And even if we talk about exergames that are much funnier and that we use at home, the sort of exercises people are doing are very similar to what they would do inside a clinical setting. Informal ways of exercise, as another example, do not usually get a place in this sort of technologies. There are certainly some technologies that we could say that are more mundane, but they are an exception in the area. The goal of this study was try to broaden the concept of self-care that we use in self-care in HCI, so that we can focus on developing self-care technologies that serve better the people that they are looking forward to serve. If self-care technologies are not achieving a great uptake, maybe it's time to take a step back and investigate the self-care of people living with chronic conditions. In this case, we were investigating Parkinson's, which is a neurodegenerative disorder that affects the brain and so manifests in motor symptoms and also non-motor ones. And drawing on this fieldwork, we will make a case that framing self-care in HCI needs a slight shift to concentrate on the practical work that people engage in. This work was based on an ethnographic informed study, drawing on in-depth interviews with patients and carers, asking them about their everyday life, about their symptoms, about the ways in which they engage in self-care. Participants were interviewed multiple times in group and individually to understand the different dimensions of self-care. We also analyzed an online community for patients and carers as a way to try to understand other parts of their self-care in a different way, and we analyzed more than 5,000 posts. The analysis was driven by grounded theory, and it was analyzed within a constructivist paradigm. Now, I would like to present you many things about this study. Unfortunately, the time that the presentation needs to occur is not that much. So I will explain a bit about one example, one person, and the activities that they were doing. So I'm going to talk to you about Arthur. So Arthur was 65 when I first met him. He was retired, he was living with his wife and with his adult son, and he used to be a bus driver, but he had to retire because of the condition. He had been living with Parkinson's for 11 years. He had some problems in the gait. For example, his left leg just lagged behind when he was walking. He had tremor in the right leg. He had dystonia, which means that his fingers kind of clawed when he was having stronger symptoms. He suffered from depression sometimes. He had sexual issues, and his symptoms got worse when he became worried. He could make a plan during these days, but it was not certain that he could achieve it, because symptoms would simply get worse from time to time during the day. He used to tell me that he felt great for his age, that he was not the worst that he would see in the hospital, and for a man of his age, he was actually quite okay, even with Parkinson's. Now, he did some very interesting things regarding his self-care. For example, regarding taking the medication, he took 3 different medication at 3 different times during the day with 3 different doses, right? And to help him keep up with his medication schedule, he was always looking at the clock. To help remind him, he also placed the medication throughout the house in different places, over the TV, over the kitchen counter, over the bedside table, as reminders that he would have to take it. He also relied on his wife and his adult son to remind him of taking the medication. And I should say that this is quite normal, because Parkinson's can impact the memory of the people, and so they actually might forget more. Sometimes he actually did forget to take this medication. For him, it was not a source of non-compliance or not wanting to take the medication at that point. He just forgot, and he needed to take it later. But it was not as simple as that. So when people living with Parkinson's forget or take a medication slightly later, they need to adjust the medication schedule that comes forward. While they might be having some period in which they have too much medication in the blood, they can have other symptoms. So it's really important to keep the distance between the medication that they take, which adds, in my opinion, even more work to the scheme. Now, other people that I interviewed was not the case with Arthur. They would also delay their medication on purpose. As Parkinson's advances, you stop being able to receive the same effect with the same medication. So the brain stops responding as well. And what happens is that people get some parts of their day in which they are on off. So the medication is not working. During those times, people don't have the same control of their body. They don't feel as well. And it's very bad, as you can imagine, if you're planning something with friends, to go in that condition. If you have an appointment at the doctor, to go in a situation that you cannot get out of the car or that you cannot park in the same way. So people usually plan their activities for the times that they are feeling better, or they delay medication on purpose to be able to attend the activities that they want. Regarding exercise, Arthur was like an athlete. He would do physiotherapy 5 times a week, 3 times in the hospital, 2 times in the patient's association. He would use a stationary bike quite regularly. He would walk a lot, and he would exercise outside his home, inside the garden. What he would do is he would take one broomstick, put it up and down, and do all sorts of exercise as a way to keep active, even during the time that he was not in the physiotherapy. In the winter, he felt that this exercise would be much harder because he was not able to move the body in the same way. But he still continued to pursue exercises. He thought that it really changed the way that he was able to move the body. He also did a lot of housework. His wife once told me that doing the dishes is exactly the same as physiotherapy, because while doing the dishes, you're moving the arms, you're moving the legs, you need to coordinate, and you're keeping the head occupied. So it's just the same as physiotherapy, she was saying. And so she keeps on recommending her husband to do all sorts of housework as a way to exercise and to keep his head occupied. I don't understand the laughs in this room, but let's assume that's not what I'm thinking about. So, and This is really interesting, and it shows all sorts of ways of complexity that Arthur's life was about. And you can imagine that other patients with Parkinson's will live in similar conditions. And they make us think about all sorts of mundane aspects of self-care that usually don't get represented in the literature. So, for example, performing self-care entails a great amount of work. This is actually a medication schedule from a patient that takes a lot more medication than Arthur was doing. Activities in itself are not straightforward to achieve. You can imagine that with such a schedule, you will be forgetting a lot of times. And they can amount to relevant time and effort to prepare to put the medication in certain places, to prepare to do the exercise, to do everything as you need to. And it's very interesting because self-care work in itself is usually undermined in the literature because the focus is on the end result. It's on the compliance, it's on the adherence, and not on the work that it takes to achieve. Another interesting point is that the activities are not separate from each other. They are kind of intertwined and ingrained in a certain person's life, right? They occur in a very specific context, like this Arthur we were seeing. He was using exercise for multiple purposes even, right? So doing exercise and also to keep his head occupied, which we don't usually see. And even if you think about the activity of the washing the dishes, that would not be something that would appear in a systematic review, right? You might see thousands of studies looking at physiotherapy interventions in exercise, but there are very little studies into informal ways of exercise actually and what they can do for people living with Parkinson's. Another issue that comes very strongly in this study was that people negotiate a lot and that they compromise what they want to do. Since they cannot do everything at all the time, people need to make a lot of choices. The delaying is one of these such choices in which people accept to have stronger symptoms at one point in order to feel better at a later point in the future. And in here there's also a contrast with the literature that tends to frame decisions as adhering or not to a certain medical advice and not considering the rationale behind these ideas, behind these decisions. It's as if people were a bit dumb and just not taking the doctor's advice. Another aspect is that self-care is really dynamic. It's not stable or predictable. You can think that Arthur, when he has a lot of concerns, for example, he gets stronger symptoms. If it's cold, he'll get stronger symptoms. If something goes wrong, he will have to deal with that. So while he might make a lot of plans, in the end, he might not be able to achieve them. And here there's also a contrast with the literature that often assumes self-care to be stable and predictable, especially when it's regarded as a treatment that clinicians would do, and so they just needed to optimize what sort of self-care people engaged in. Now, I'm going to talk to you about 3 simple ideas of how I see this different framing of self-care and what self-care technologies could be about. It's not the only thing that we could be doing, but there are some ideas that might lead into this direction of creating more mundane self-care technologies. So one thing that we can do is really to focus on the practical work that people do, right? So trying to make a shift from clinical outcomes and clinicians to everyday issues and people living with a chronic condition. And one example of this would be to support informal ways of exercise. If people are using a bicycle or if they are doing dishes, is there some way that we can count these activities as part of the way that we understand self-care? Also, we might want to support more the negotiations and compromises and enable, for example, people to delay their medication. Unlike just having a yes or no, maybe delay, maybe replan, maybe snooze, to give them some flexibility of doing what they want to do with their self-care. And in this case, we might think, oh, but maybe that's not a good decision. But then let's inform people rather than restrict what they can do, because they themselves will be the ones being able to take the right decision for them. The last one is to support dynamic changes in self-care. As the condition is always changing, it is important to support adaptations to plans, enabling people to be flexible about their activities, for example, by enabling them to write self-reports at different times and not focusing on the person as if they would have always to follow a clock. With this presentation, I really want to have one takeaway, and it is that self-care is really complex and really made of a lot of practical work, right? There's a lot of activities people do that they are connected intricately with their lives and that are a result of all these negotiations that people go at every day. And also a pledge that I have is that we can actually improve the lives of people living with chronic conditions. But in order to do that, we will need to focus much more on the activities that they do as part of their everyday life. While it might be great to support clinical care, and HCI has done a lot of work on that, it's time to shape a bit more the research so that we are contributing to technologies that really change people's lives on the things that they deal with every day. And with this, I finish my talk, and I thank you for the attention.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Bissoni. I'm from City University of London, and I just had a quick question about your choice in words. Calling it mundane, is that something that comes from literature, and why did you not choose to pick a word that's a bit more powerful about these little aspects that actually mean a great deal? That's all. Oh, great talk, by the way.
I'm not sure if mundane is not having the impact that you would expect, but it's all about these routinary, these banal aspects that usually don't get accounted for. That might be very simple things, right? This washing the dishes is, it's quite of an example, right? But it's the person's life, right? And if there is such an impact from such a simple decision or such a simple part of their life, why not call it mundane, right? Why not call it simply nothing, right? It's just an aspect, a very small one, but it is the person's life.